Hello and welcome to These Are the Good Old Days, a brand new program here on the Rainham Cable Channel. Selectman Don McKinnon is our host, and we have special guests today, Patrice White, Kathleen Roberts, and Reverend Jim Tilbe. Don, I'm going to throw it over to you and explain what is this all about. These were the good old days.
Well,
These are the good old days.
These are the good old days. One of the things, I believe Kathleen was the one who interviewed Albert Porter at his home. And there are people that we might have to go to their home or nursing home or what have you to interview them. But we interviewed Al Porter, Kathleen did, and I think they taped over on it within the next week and it was gone. And the Al Porter Award now is historical. It's been going on now for 15 years and around there probably, and we have no record of it. We have no record of the Walter O'Briens or Eddie Murby or Ted Janis or any of these historical people who really, when I say these are the good old days, that isn't that long ago. Those people were active within the past half century. So there's two different phases that I think we should be interested in. And one is the original history, which is why the authors are here today. And the other is the current history, which will be individuals who will be invited on, or we'll go visit them. Pat, once a month we'll try to do it, and try to bring in history at the moment so that, and by the way, we won't tape over it for a softball game or something. And so what we'll do is keep those tapes in the either Historical Society or Historical Commission and accumulate them over the years so that someday when it goes back, including town meetings and things of this nature, that will all be available to the historical commissions in the future. So that's, and I thought it would be best, you and I both decided, to have the authors of the history of the church, because without the church, there was no Rainham. It was a school and a church. If it wasn't, you wouldn't be incorporated. Right. And also in the history of the town of Rainham, and for that, of course, Kathleen is finishing hers one of these days, and I keep trying to talk to her, take a little section and put it out there, and we'll put that on TV. And of course, Patrice has the complete history of the town of Rainham. We thank her very much for that. So what this evening is the kickoff of These Are the Good Old Days, meaning that we're going to have an introduction to Rainham as historians tell it, which our historians are here this evening.
Very good. Now, who shall we begin with? Whose book dates back the furthest? Would that be yours, Pat, or Reverend Tilbe's? Yes.
Whatever.
Okay, why don't you begin and just tell us a little bit about what your book is about and how you came to write it.
I'd be glad to. My book is The History of Rainham, researched and compiled in 1988, published in 1990. Now, how this came about was the Rainham School Department decided that it was time to include the teaching of the history of Rainham in the social studies program. So they needed somebody to gather the material, to compile it, and to create a resource book for the school teachers so that they could teach the history. Now, they knew that I was very interested in the history of Rainham. When I married, I became part of the White family, which is one of the original families. I felt touched by the history of Rainham because my husband Richard's father, Alman K. White, was the first appointed, can I hold that up? Yeah, chief of police in Rainham. Prior to 1930, the law was controlled by constables who were appointed by the Board of Selectmen. But by 1930, they decided, oh, we'd better have a chief. So they appointed Alman King White as chief. Now here he is standing outside his home on Hill Street. There was no chief of police office because there had not been a chief of police. So they changed the front room of the family home into an office for him, and here he is. The story goes that when Alman White was chief, people obeyed the law. He was fair, and he was strong. One of the legends is that he broke up a fight between two men and ended up with one under each arm. That's how strong he was. I don't know whether that's legend or fact, but whatever. I like it. I like legends anyway. So they came to me. They applied for a Horace Mann grant, and they got it. And so I started researching. Now, at the Rainham Public Library, what was there were scraps of paper that had been cut in a cardboard box under a desk. Nobody who went in wanted to go through that, and actually the librarians did not want people manhandling it either. And of course you couldn't take it home to research it, so I spent many, many hours going through that. I also went through all the town reports. They have a wonderful collection of town reports there. I went to the Taunton Public Library, and they were very generous sharing what they had with me. I went to the Taunton Gazette and spent one whole February school vacation, long days, going through their archives. That was fun, though. And then I went to Old Colony Historical Society, and of course I went through all their microfiche and spent hours and hours and hours there. I interviewed older people in Rainham to see what they could share with me. I promised myself I would only spend X number of hours a day on this, but it became addictive. And it would be 9 o'clock at night, plus after supper I had to correct English papers. English teachers have to do that. But then I would get to this, and Dick would say, I thought you weren't going to do that tonight. But you know, at first everything I found I wrote down because it was all new and I was collecting it. But after a year, I had to read for a long time before I would find something new to add, and that would be exciting. Okay, then it came time, let's see, Linda Ashcraft was a wonderful help typing up my handwritten notes, and Diane McGuire was just a wonderful editor. She knew how to use the computer long before I knew how to turn one on, and they were just wonderful. When it came time to publish it, the school asked for another Horace Mann grant, and they got it. And so I had money to purchase pictures from Old Colony Historical Society and so forth. Then we sold them, and when it came, I had chosen, Dick and I had chosen the cover with the seal of Rainham and the name. So I wasn't surprised when I opened the box. We had chosen the color and so forth. What surprised me pleasantly, was on the spine it had The History of Rainham by M. Patrice White. And I became so excited because I could just picture this up on people's shelves. And my husband kind of shook his head and said, well, yeah, I expected it would be there, but I just hadn't thought about it. Another exciting time was when I received the official notice from the Library of Congress that my book was indeed there, and it did have a number and so forth. That felt like a real offer.
How long did the whole process take?
2 years.
2 years. Wow.
Yeah. 2 years.
Excellent. Reverend Tilbe, tell us about your book. How did that get started?
Well, our book, If These Stones Could Speak, of course, a reference to the Stone Church. Every church should have a history so that the people can read. And our history, of course, goes back to the beginning of Rainham and beyond, really, because we started before Rainham was officially incorporated as a town. So there were 3 of us, Dot Newton, Bonnie Lester, and myself, were interested in recording the history of the church. It had been recorded here and there, bits and pieces, but we wanted to get it all together into one place. So we started in on that, divided up duties and researched different things. But we spent a couple of years on our book as well. It takes some time to get these things together.
Absolutely.
Yes.
No question about that. How many copies were produced?
Well, you're testing my memory because this was back in 1994, and I believe we had about 300 copies produced. We still have a few.
Okay, all right. Now, Kathleen, your book is obviously still in process, but you had obviously the experience of doing a book before, so you...
I actually started sometime in the 1980s, because when I came to Rainham, I thought, since I'd written the history of Dartmouth for the children there, I would do the same here. But then I thought, well, I'll do the history of the town. but I obviously would never be able to finish that. So now I'm calling it Glimpses of the History of Rainham. I have 65 chapters done, but they're small chapters, short chapters, I should say. And I really don't have to do too much more since I've called it Glimpses. No longer call it the history, just Glimpses. But I had hoped it would be done before now, but I have to wait a few more months until my eye feels better. But it shouldn't take me too much longer to do it. But I spent time at hours and hours at Old Colony. I looked through a lot of the old newspapers and everything I could get. I also used the box at the library. I've used it many, many times, and probably only people like us, for the most part, use it. But it's very valuable.
It is.
And there will be more. Hopefully, the book of mine will be in there eventually. And I also talk to people. See, some of mine is like oral history, so that I just have to quote that I talked to the person. Now, some of the programs that I did for the cable, I had copies of it, or they had copies of it. But when they changed the station up there, I think Pat was the one that said, I suggest you get the copies that you've left there, because they did them over and over again. And when we went up, lo and behold, they had discarded them, all except 5, and I brought these here. And they're going to see if they could change them so they could, I guess you'd say, digitalize them.
Right.
So hopefully there are 5 of them. And one in particular I'm fond of because it was taken in the cemetery in the fall when the leaves were so beautiful. And I was riding in, let's see,
I believe it was the 1913 antique automobile.
so something like that, and driving around in an
Who'd
old
have 'em?
car.
Larry
that
is
old.
right.
Car. And that was Betty Thompson's brother.
Larry
did that.
Grassi.
Yes, he had them, and that was fun. And so it was really a big disappointment to find that what I had spent hours on was just tossed away. But unfortunately, I wasn't up there when they were throwing things out.
And as you mentioned, Kathleen, too, there are some that we have, but technology changes so that now you need to get some of the old equipment to be able to transfer it in new equipment. And
Well, the gentleman here said he would
Try to see if we can
but
do
I
that,
haven't
right?
asked him recently. I know he's been busy.
Dawn, why is it important that even children in school and so forth learn about the history of Rainham through Pat's book? And
There's really two
James.
histories of every place. One is the one that's true, and the other is the one that's legendary. And I prefer legendary myself.
More interesting.
Yes. As I say, some of the stories I tell are true. Most aren't. But there's 2 things we've done recently through the cooperation of the commission. One is we've taken over an office in the town hall. Now that was the office that there was a little bit of a disagreement at one time between the would be the technical worker, which we didn't need anymore. So that office opens up. So that is now, there is an office down right next to the Board of Health office that is now for the Historical Commission. And so if people are doing research, they'll be able to use
Place.
that office. The other is at Gilmore Hall, and I've long tried to, in its early stage, take Gilmore Hall first floor and make that for the Historical Commission, and have some things there. I know, for example, anything after the 1731 should be ours, and so Kathleen, I've drafted her to go down to the historical, where is the name down, Taunton?
Old Colony.
Won't call me.
And we're going to get Toby Gilmore's cannon. Now, I know Kathleen isn't sure we can do this because it is on the 2nd floor. So this is gonna be a little tricky. But I figure if we get there about 2 a.m.
And this is top secret, everybody out there.
Well,
so,
everybody has to be able from Rainham to keep a secret. So, and we get it on a day when the Taunton police are very busy, and we'll get that down and walk that up 138 and deposit it in Gilmore Hall. And that will be the beginning of our historical museum, if you will, something like that. But actually what's happened is a lot of people have either, as you say, Kathleen, taped over or destroyed paraphernalia. People have moved out of town.
Right.
The guy I've got to talk to and get a hold of him is Brady Fitz. And Brady moved out of town. At the time, I celebrated. I was terrible because there were things, every time you went to do something, Brady would find an Indian burial ground or something like that, and you couldn't do it, you know. But now, as I get older, I look back, I say, I got to get a hold of that guy and find out what he has or what he knew and things of this nature, because for some reason, he wasn't from Rainham, but he became our historical scholar, it seems
Yes,
to me.
very much so.
He was very into the town of Rainham. And when I think of geography, there's a plot of Rainham, which is about 22 square miles. But we were part of Taunton.
Right.
And I know one of the people we'd like to talk to in the future would be Billy Hanna. And Billy has written the history of Taunton. And who was it, Kathleen? Who headed up? We were by the gravestones. You put me by a gravestone and put me in a jacket.
Historical Society had a special event
Historical
there. Remember,
Society.
Kathleen?
Yes.
And I was,
We've had Hannah
and I
as a
was
speaker.
James Leonard having a wonderful time till the mayor of Taunton showed up, who knows history.
Oh, yeah.
So this isn't good, because this guy knows it, you know. So I had to revert right back to, because James Leonard never lived in the town of Rainham. He lived in the town of Taunton, because when he arrived here, it was Taunton.
Still Taunton.
And so I just think all these pieces are, and I loved your book and this book, I've read them both. I'm looking forward to yours, and Pat, you've got a couple of things which we'll have a show on someday. There's different people who have written different history, and before we forget about it and
Right.
get on to other things, I want to bring that to the Historical Society / Commission, working in a cooperative way,
Right.
and get this really established so that people down the road will have this information. And so this was the reason I've started the ball rolling, and we'll see where it goes. I think this evening is very, very good, very informational.
Sure.
And-
And Dawn, too, if anybody out there in the listening audience has anything of historical value or knows of anything that they want to share with us, you know, either coming on a future program or even just providing us with the information, or if it's something we can take a photo of or whatever, that would all help us to put together, you know, the best history we can of
In the,
town of
in
Rainham.
the Hannett, we'll call it a garage, do we call it, or a barn, whatever you call it, there is a item that is a scale. It is a large piece of metal that you can coordinate to get an accurate weight. And it came, I think, from the school. Then it was going to be going to the landfill. I mean, that piece of metal alone would be worth something. And Johnny Welch stopped by. There was a yard sale, and he was a sealer of weights and measures at the time. And he went, "What in the world are you doing?" So we've kept, that would be something that could go into Gilmore Hall, because it's of no value in a garage just sitting there. So there are things of that nature that
Well, have you ever seen a young child look at a phone with a rotary dial? Oh my God, it's like something that arrived from outer space, you know?
I know.
Things change so
And
quickly.
we all,
You know,
except
and
for
with
the
all of-
Reverend, we've all used those.
With all the technology within the last 50 years,
That's right.
so much has changed, so much has happened. Absolutely.
So that's the reason for it, and that's what I'd like to start it off. And as time goes by, we'll invite different people in of a historical nature presently in the town of Rainham. It is sorry we've had people, Marty Newfield just
Lost.
passed within the last week.
Right.
And you talk about a guy who understands the history of Taunton and Rainham.
Right.
It was Marty.
Absolutely. Now, Reverend Tilbe, let me just ask you that through the process of your research and so forth, anything particularly surprised you or impress you that you discovered?
One of the things that didn't surprise me, but it surprises a lot of people, is the fact that back in colonial times and in the early history of our nation, there was no separation of church and state. And as Don alluded to, when Rainham was established, it was because the people who lived here wanted a separate church. They didn't want to travel all the way to the center of Taunton, as if that's a long distance. But travel that on foot on a January morning when it's 5 degrees below zero, and it's a long distance.
Right.
So they wanted originally to have a separate precinct within Taunton, but that wasn't going to happen. So they petitioned to have a separate town, and the legislature, the colonial legislature at the time, said yes, finally, after some persistence.
Yes, yes.
Yes, you can have a separate town providing you have a church with a learned minister and a school teacher. Those were the two provisions, the only two provisions that were set for the town to have it separate. So the church paid to have the first meeting house already constructed but finished, and paid the costs, paid the salary of the minister when he started. And this went on for quite a while. And then, of course, we have our nation founded, and you think, well, then that was the end of that. It wasn't. When the Constitution came into effect, then we have what we now call separation of church and state. But in Massachusetts, it didn't really come to reality until about 1831. And up until that time, the town was collecting money for support of the church. And for a long time, what we called the First Congregational Church was the only church in Rainham. There were Baptists in town early on, 1750s or so. The beginning of the Baptist church, they talk about the 1780s, but I think it was a little earlier than that. It may have started and stopped and started and stopped, finally started again. Rainham was forward-thinking in that in 1783, they said, if you belong to the Baptist church, you don't have to pay the tax that supports the congregational church. So I think we were ahead of our time way back when.
Really?
Yes. So that, that's an issue, separation of church and state, that's still in the news today. And way back when, it was an issue, to be sure.
Now, the first church was not at its present location.
Correct. No one knows exactly where it was. It most likely was, not too far from Don's house.
I lay claim Richmond Street.
Probably
And
the
just
north
before
side
you
of
get to
Richmond
Warren,
Street.
yeah,
Yes.
I think that's where it
Yes.
was.
It was certainly near the forge,
Right.
no doubt about
Well,
that.
that's when I asked the mayor where was James Leonard. I couldn't find out where I would stay after the show, because there was no place, no burial site for him. And he told me it was on Warren Street. He found Richmond, left on Warren, and right back there is James Leonard's burial site. So he must have lived in that area, because generally they would bury them in the
Yes.
backyard.
There was a cemetery that's disappeared now, not too far from where those condos are, I think.
That's and also there's I call her assistant superintendent. She's the chief coordinator of Rainham, and her house goes way back. And I've gained permission, and she told me her dog doesn't bite,
How good.
to go back down that driveway and to look. She gave me permission to go down there and search for that burial site. But I would imagine it would have been seen by now. Lou Pacheco says a lot of mosquitoes back there. Very, very careful.
Definitely, definitely. Now, Pat, tell us something from the beginning. King Philip, what's the story? We don't have an awful lot of time, but what's the story with King Philip?
We need an awful lot
We
of
know
time.
a lot of time, but
Yeah, we'll do that another day too. But still, King Philip and its, if you can digest it, would be
a
great,
little
Pat.
bit.
King Philip. Okay, let's see. He lived in, who knows, these legends blend, don't they?
Yeah.
But he came summers to Fowling Pond in Rainham. He became friendly with the Leonards, who ran the Iron Forge. They made him instruments. He gave them something to eat, fish and game. When the war did break out, because the white men were taking over land, they thought it belonged to them, or they thought they could take it anyway, and the Indians thought it belonged to them, so anyway, the war broke out. Rainham was spared, according to legend, because King Philip said, do not touch anybody who lives in this area.
Very good.
The
Kath-
legend does have it that one man was riding his horse, and when the Indians were fighting them at that time, and it knocked his hat off. He kept going, and so he was not hurt. That's probably just a legend.
But I like legends.
But it sounds good.
Legends are fun.
I love legends, though.
Johnny Welch took me down to the last oral history Leonard in Lakeville, I believe he lived at the time. And he suggested that King Philip got together with the Leonards and said to them, we can't leave you alone. Of course, it was not Rainham at the time, it was Taunton. And so I'm going to give you a choice, either your house or your barn. Well, people would normally today say the barn, but that was very valuable, the barn in those days. And they had to make their choice. They said, we're going to burn one of them, because if we don't burn them, you're in a lot of trouble. You look like you're on the wrong side. So they made their choice according to the legend of I think it was David Leonard was his name. And he said that they made their choice. They'd let King Philip know which ones they want torched.
Fascinating. Kathleen, what about, through your history, your research, what particularly interested you or really impressed you about the history of Rainham? It's a lot of history from this area. New England completely, but particularly, we've got a real rich history.
Well, I'm also impressed with the fact of the women who at that time really would have been heroines if people knew about them, what they had done. For example, Amy Leonard was of the Leonard family, of course, and she went in the Civil War, volunteered to be a nurse. She had graduated from Bridgewater Normal School, which had just opened, and she was ready to be a teacher, but she thought she had to do her part. And she enlisted, and she was trained, and she got very, very ill, as many people did, with the fever that was around at the time of the war, and they expected that she would die. And they begged her to go home. And she said, no, as long as there is one young fellow here who needs me, I will stay. And she stayed, and she got over that fever and remained until the end of the war.
Didn't she fund the statue out in front?
Yes, she was the
library.
prime giver of that statue at the library.
Beautiful statue.
Because it says A.B. Leonard and Friends. She also was one of two who gave the most number of books when the library opened.
Wow.
Yes. Very, very much interested in education. And another thing about her, in the 1800s in particular, and the early 1900s, it was quite common in towns to have spelling bees, and Amy won several times. Yeah.
Very good. Don, believe it or not, we are just about out of time.
I
But this
know.
is just a
Well, we want
taste
this
of what we're going to
tape
be
kept
doing.
though, right, Pat? This one, no
Absolutely.
softball game
No,
over this tape.
And we may have to do 2 a month, Don.
Right.
We have a lot
We
to
might,
cover.
That was fast.
Yeah,
wasn't
that
was a
was
good time.
fast. But we're
Yeah.
going to wrap it up for today and thank our guests today, Patrice White, Kathleen Roberts, Reverend Jim Tilbe. We're going to have them back again.
Definitely.
Our host, Don McKinnon.
Definitely.
We want to thank all of you for joining us for our first These Are the Good Old Days. We'll see you here in our next episode.